Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we're going to fit the Lesu bumper to the Scania. Sounds simple, but it's really designed for a 6x4 chassis, which will make life a bit tricky later in the video. Before we get started though, the bumper kit uses some rather small fixings. There's some screws with a 2mm hex head, which is not a size that you usually find in your toolkit. Happily, there's loads of 2mm drivers around. I got this one on eBay for just a couple of quid. Also, there's some 2.5mm hex screws and some very small Phillips head screws. So rather than buy more individual drivers, I thought I'd give one of these kits a try. They're just under a tenner, so I'm not expecting the best quality, but as long as we're careful not to slip, they should last for a good while. We've got the 2.5mm driver, along with lots of other driver bits. Should come in handy for a lot of things down the line. In the Lesu kit you get the main bumper, which is machined aluminium, and it does feel like it's made from a good solid block rather than those brittle lightweight castings that you often end up with. There's the screws bag, which has loads of tiny fixings in it. We've got the amber and clear lenses along with the light pipe for the rear number plate. Here's the red lenses. Now all three of the colours are the same shape. It looks like they just cut off the right amount from a long moulding. Some rather nice scale diamond plate, which has got grooves cut in it, so it will bend very nicely to match the bumper. These are the number plate lights. Now they're just surface mount white LEDs with some very fine wire soldered on. Here's the aluminium crossmember that mounts to the back of the bumper, and the three plastic lens holders. This is the full width rubber mud flap with its metal strip that's used to clamp it to the bumper. One of the best and the worst bits in this kit is this PCB. Now it's an excellent idea. It just mounts up to the inside of the bumper and it lines up all the LEDs for you. Very nice. The downside is they're all wired in parallel, which really isn't friendly for the LEDs. If they were wired with their own resistors, it would be fine. Sharing a single resistor is going to shorten the life of the LEDs at best, and at worst a couple will run very brightly for a few seconds and burn out. I'll pop a link in the description to a nice short article that talks about why it's not the best idea. And of course, if you search for parallel LEDs, you're going to find some more examples. The first step of the build is to fit the lenses to the mounts. Now there's three of them, two of the large ones that go on the ends and a single height one that goes in the middle. For the screws, we need the bag with the smallest self-tappers. There's lots of them and they're quite ridiculously small. They'd be very easy to lose, so be careful. It's a Phillips head, so we'll need to pick the bit that fits the best. A fairly good way to gauge how well it's fitting is to find the largest bit that fits, and then when you pop it into the screw head that it stays put and doesn't fall off. If it does fall off, try another one. To fit the lenses, we need to carefully cut them free from the sprue, making sure we end up with a nice clean edge. There's really no room for any extra plastic. You may need to very carefully trim the excess with a sharp knife. Now all we do is pop the lenses in and install the two screws. The lenses aren't all that thick, so don't tighten the screws too far. They just need the slack taking out any more and you might risk cracking the lens. Repeat another 19 times, following the colour guide in the instructions, and we can move on to the next page. Step 2, the number plate lights. Now we need to be very careful with these. If we flex the wires too much, they're going to break off the LEDs. We need to try and keep them stable as much as we can. All we should need to do is pop the LEDs into the clear plastic mount. Now they're a fairly good fit in there, but not quite perfect. If we offer it up to the bumper, it's clear after a few bumps they could easily pop out. I think what we're going to end up doing is use a little bit of glue to hold them in. Most clear glues will do. It doesn't really matter if it's not the strongest bond in the world. I wouldn't recommend CA or superglue though, as it might fog up the plastic. I'm going to be using some poly cement, which won't stick brilliantly to the LED, but it should be good enough. Once it's dry, we can push the mount into the bumper. Now it's a fairly tight fit, so we need to make sure that it goes in nice and straight, or it's going to get hung up at an angle. To hold it in step 3, Lesu use a small metal plate that fits with two M2 screws. It's easy enough to fit, and on the face of it, it looks like a good solution. However, the metal, conductive plate is right up next to the wires. If something moves or rubs, it could ever so easily lead to a short, which really wouldn't be great. Instead, I'm going to remove the plate and just use a couple of squirts of hot glue. It'll stick the plastic to the bumper as well as add a little bit of stress relief to the wires, so we won't be quite so worried about them snapping off. On step 4 we install the light lens assemblies and the PCB. What we do is offer up the centre lenses on the outside and the PCB on the inside. To attach them we use some of the small M2 screws. There's 3 in the middle and 2 on each of the large lenses. I found the small screws were a little on the short side. They do hold things together okay, but they strip the plastic very easily. When they're in, the bumper starts to look rather good. All those small screws do add some nice detail. It's well worth the effort. Okay, step 5 now, and the diamond plate. To mount it, we use 4 of the really small hex head screws with nuts and 2 of the slightly larger screws. Because the back of the plate has grooves in it, making it bend to the shape of the bumper is really simple. If you just hold it over the bumper and gently bend, it'll follow the grooves for a perfect fit. The 4 holes on the back use the smaller of the hex head screws. They pass through the plate and straight through the bumper. Now it might have been nice if the bumper was tapped M2, as instead we need to fit nuts on the inside, which is going to be a little bit tricky. I ended up using the 2mm driver on the screw head and the 2.5mm driver on the nut. I found I could just about hold the 2.5mm driver in place while tightening the screw. It was a little bit awkward, but quite doable. The 2 larger screws that go into the top of the bumper are much easier. The bumper is threaded, so it's just a case of threading in the screws and nipping them up. It would probably be a good idea to use a tiny bit of thread lock too. Using one of those small screws would be a real pain to replace. Step 6, the mudflap, crossmember and the arches. Now it's not immediately clear what's supposed to be included with the bumper kit in this one. I thought maybe the arches were Lesu parts rather than the Tamiya ones that come with the truck. There is however a note in Chinese just below the diagram, and with the use of technology we can translate it. Just as my phone did the translation, I immediately noticed it also translated Lesu to sluggish, which is a bit strange. I'm guessing it's picked the wrong language. Anyway, the Chinese note just says that the fenders are from the original car and not included with the Lesu bits, so that makes life simple. The crossmember sits on the back of the bumper and uses some enormous M3 screws. Actually they're just standard countersunk M3s, but compared to the rest of the kit they do seem quite big. The 4 screws just screw straight in and get nipped up. The mudflap is easy enough to install, but it's a bit of a pain to get all the holes lined up. We'll start with one end so we can line up the threaded hole in the bumper, the hole in the rubber and the hole in the metal strip. Then install one of the small short screws. Moving on to the other end, we need to stretch the rubber just a little bit to get it to line up and install the other screw. To get the rest in, you might need to fiddle with the rubber a little bit to get the holes to line up. Just keep working on it until the screws drop in. Now the bumper is really starting to look the part, and as far as the instructions go, it's complete. There's one more step, step 7, which has us fit the bumper to the chassis, but it's not quite that simple on a 4x2. They also want us to install 2 more screws on the front edge of the plate, but they're going to need some holes drilling to the top of the chassis, and to do it properly they need tapping with an M2 tap 2. Now if you were building the bumper for a 6x4 chassis, the rest is easy. You just remove the stock bits and fit the Lesu. On a 4x2 though, to make it work, there's a little bit of modding to do. First then, we need to remove a rear wheel. Like most RCs, it's just an M4 nut. Next, there's 2 M3 screws that attach the arch to the chassis. Same on the other side, and that's the chassis visible. The rails end just in front of the shackles, which is mounted to a chassis extension. The new bumper replaces that whole assembly. To remove the extension, we need to unscrew the 2 screws at the top of the shackles. The screws thread into nylock nuts, so keep an eye on them when they drop out. Next, there's 4 self-tappers that attach the extension to the chassis. They come out and we can slide the extension out. Now if we slide the new bumper on, it does actually fit. However, the rear of the leaf spring is right up in the corner, so there's no space for the shackle to mount and swing. With the arch on, we can see that there's just enough space at the front to take the shackle. It'll mean it swings forward, which isn't 100% ideal, but for how these trucks are run, it'll be just fine. Now it's not easy to see, but looking underneath you can see the end of the leaf is really tight up in the corner. On a 6x2 chassis, this really isn't an issue because the leaf spring is the other way up, and the two axles are mounted right at the ends, so there's nothing sticking out. What we will do then is mount the crossmember that the front of the leaves are mounted to back just a little bit and flip it over, which will allow for the shackle. Then at the back we will flatten out the area on the bumper right in the corner and drill a hole for the static end of the leaf spring. It will be tight, but it should work. Here we go then. Sometime later, we've got the back end stripped off the chassis already, so I could drill some holes safely. The new ones on the chassis are just shy of 9mm further back to the stock ones. Any further and the shackles end up rubbing the wheel arches. The crossmember that uses the 2 holes has 2 holes for self-tappers and 2 with captured nuts. We want the holes with the nuts for the shackles, so the crossmember has to be flipped over. For now, we'll just use the self-tappers in the bottom holes while it waits for the shackles. Here's the bumper after its mods. If we look right up in the corners, you can see where I've trimmed a little bit of aluminium back to get the leaf mounts as far back as possible. And of course you can see the hole for the screw. The rear axle assembly can offer up, lining up the back end of the leaf springs and its mounts to the holes in the bumper. The mounts and screws are just as they came off the front of the springs when it was taken apart. To attach them, we'll use some internal Starlock washers. These will bite into the aluminium bumper and the nut and stop them coming loose without needing to try and get any thread lock down in there. To say this is going to be a bit fiddly would be an understatement. To fit the nut, I had to use some pliers as I couldn't get anything else in there. Even a small open-ended spanner wouldn't go in. As long as you've got a good grip, it is quite doable though. Now we can slide the axle assembly with its crossmember back into the chassis, which will be closely followed by the bumper. Now the bumper comes with 4 M3 screws to mount it to the chassis, so we're going to use those. When doing them up, keep a little bit of forward pressure on the bumper so it butts up against the end of the chassis. That way it should end up fairly straight. For the front of the leaf spring, we're going to need to fit the shackle plates. We'll need one of the large shoulder screws with the plate inserted through the inside. Then another shackle plate on the outside with an M3 nylock to hold it all together. The other end of the shackle uses one of these mounts, which again goes in from the inside. This time though we use a plastic spacer in between the plates. Now we just swing it around and pop in a long M3 screw. Make sure all the other screws are nipped up, and that's this side of the axle hung. The other side is exactly the same. Now, I think I missed filming it, but there's a couple of screws that mount the crossmember above the axle. There's just a couple of self-tappers though, and of course if you built the truck in the first place, it's going to be pretty obvious. Now if we compress the suspension, you can see it's working quite nicely. Except, because the axle now moves forwards under compression, the prop shaft can't take up the difference. To fix that, we're going to swap it out for a telescopic shaft, but that's going to have to wait until I can actually get one. All that's left then is to refit the arch with its 2 screws. Pop the drive hex on, followed by a wheel, and do up the M4 nut. Same on the other side, and that's the chassis ready to roll. The only other thing to consider is the 2 small screws at the front of the diamond plate. To fit them, we need to drill a couple of holes and tap them to M2. Now I don't have an M2 tap, so that will have to wait too, but I am going to be at the London Model Engineering Expo next week, so we should be able to get one there. That's it for the build this week then. There's still plenty to do on the truck, so we'll probably see some more next week. In the meantime, just as a reminder, we do have a Discord server now. I put up some invites in the last week's description, which went very quickly, so I've put some more in this week's description. For those who don't know Discord, it's a free text and voice chat service that runs in the browser, on the desktop and on mobile. Click the link in the description to join the RC Mojo server and hang out with some like-minded people. As always, thanks for watching, like if you like, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a comment if there's something on your mind. Bye guys!